A diner bell chimed like an alarm that morning, a thin ring that cut the habitual hush into two pieces. The coffee brewer droned, a small steam cloud hovering over the chrome counter, and the neon sign outside buzzed impatient blue, painting stripes across the linoleum. Clara Thompson had been wiping the same stretch of Formica for 12 years. The motion had become a kind of vigil. She felt the wood of the broom handle in her palm as plainly as she felt the apron tied at her waist. Apron, broom, coffee pot, the tools of invisible work. She noticed the little things first. The scuff on a booth, a napkin tucked wrong, the way the bell's sound came out thin when someone pushed the door open twice in a single breath. If you like stories that hold the hard things steady and honor those who stand up for others, stay until the end. If this one finds a place with you, consider subscribing and sharing. Leave a respectful comment and check the description for resources on how to report concerns or seek help if you or someone you know is in danger. The girl who burst through the door had the kind of smallness that still moved like a weather front. Emma Grace Watkins was 7 or 8, hair in a loose knot, a backpack strap hanging over one shoulder, eyes raw with edges of panic. She stood on the threshold and called into the room, voice thin and urgent. "He's coming!" Her words packed the noon into a single stopped breath. Clara dropped the dish she had been drying. The porcelain hit the stainless steel sink with a hollow, frightened sound. The customers went quiet in a way that the coffee cups themselves seemed to listen. Betty, who owned the place, set down a pan as if it were a shield and stepped forward with the practiced gentleness of someone who had handled other people's pain for decades. Behind the counter, Clara crossed to the girl before thought could unspool into fear. This was the moment a person either stepped into the doorways of other people's troubles or pretended the door had never opened. Emma's words unraveled at close range. She had been in the bathroom, she said, and a man with a tidy smile had come to the school, pretending to be a counselor. He had a badge, she said. He had told her that if she came with him, she would be safe. She asked for shelter and had run when a car came to the curb. The shape of the story was small and sharp. Promises, a badge, a ride, a name she couldn't quite hold because it felt like ashes when she tried. Clara's first move was practical. She pulled a coffee mug from the rack, poured hot water into it for Emma to hold, and took the backpack from the girl's slack hand. Emma smelled faintly of playground dust and orange juice, and the mug steadied her fingers enough to find their way into the paper handle. "Sit down," Clara said. Her voice was plain. It was precisely the kind of voice that did not ask permission to be in trouble's room. It entered and shut the door. "You okay to tell me his name?"
Betty asked, voice low. Emma shook her head. Tears blurred the edges of her chin. She clutched something small in her palm and opened her fist like someone offering a relic. A tiny bracelet winked at Clara in the fluorescence, a brass butterfly on a frayed leather band. It was an ordinary charm, but Clara treated it like a map. She had learned over the years that little things carried histories bigger than your hand. "He says my mom will get in trouble," Emma whispered. "He said I'd go somewhere far and I'd forget. He wears a gray coat. He had—" Here the child faltered. Clara bent down, as if the lowering of height could pull the sentence back into solidity. "A riding crop," Emma finished, the words like lifting stones from her chest. A man in a gray coat did, in fact, stand at the door of Mayfield Diner at that moment. He had that practiced dignity of someone who'd learned to look harmless. Polished shoes, a haircut without a hair out of place, a smile that tracked like a default setting. He carried himself like a volunteer meeting a crowd, or a consultant knocking on the wrong door for the right reason. He wore a small laminated credential clipped to his lapel. In it, somebody could read the word counselor. In the life he carried, logos and lanyards were teeth. "What's going on here?" he said, voice flat as a coin. He stepped into light, and Clara watched him like a person learning the circumference of a new animal. The man waited for the line of identification, the moment when civility would suffice. It did not occur to him that civility could be an interrogation. "You're not welcome here," Clara told him, an edge in her voice that had nothing to do with brass or badge. Betty reached for the phone under the counter before he could say anything else. People at the counter shifted, as if agreeing with something they hadn't yet decided. That the diner was, for a minute, a safe harbor, and that they would not let him take the current of a child. The coat snapped. The riding crop came out of nowhere, short, black, the kind of thing that marked a person who wanted to draw lines without touching skin. He hissed that the child belonged with him, that she was confused, that someone had called him. The words were lit like a match. The crop came down in a motion calibrated to announce authority. It was meant to scare. Clara stepped between them. She felt the wooden shaft tap the side of her forearm before the full blow landed. Metal gray pain flared, and a thin thread of blood streaked her sleeve where skin had protested. She tasted copper at the back of her tongue, small and immediate and terribly honest. The hurtedness in her body made the rest of her sharp. It stilled the ground under the argument and set something like fact. Clara wrapped her left arm around Emma without relinquishing the broom in the other, as if the sweep of ordinary tools could fence out something criminal. "You get out," she said. She had remembered that, in the corner of the counselor's car, there had been a sticker, something like a strip of paper with Unit 42 written on it. It was an odd memory, strange as remembering a color. But she put the number into Detective Morrison's palm like a small, exact charge. The butterfly bracelet trembled when she held it up. It would become, later, a thread that tied the girl's terror to an address. Detective Morrison made a call that tightened the web. She placed a piece of paper on the counter with the words, "Missing Person Report, Pickup Order, Contact Riverside Elementary." She had already begun to make the invisible conversation between school logs and police software audible. A school secretary's memory, cross-referenced with drop-off times, the GPS ping of a car that had been on Highway 17, each fact folded the day tighter. The man's charm could always be altered. What could not be altered were records, the entries of a sign-in sheet, the camera feed at the school, the rental ledger at Storage Plus on County Road. The man in the gray coat, Richard Garrett, the lanyard said, a tidy name for tidy crimes, found himself in the back seat of a patrol car. He tried a few of the things his type had been trained in: flattery, shock, eyes that slid from man to man in search of an ally. He pressed his hand to his side, as if the world had bruised him. The bruises on Clara's arm would be photographed and filed. She had a thin red line on her sleeve that would become evidence, the shape of an ordinary woman's body standing across the path between predation and child. Clara sat with the paramedics while they wrapped her shoulder. The paper bandage smelled of antiseptic and cotton, and the way people make sure wounds are described small enough to be taken care of. Emma hovered and then leaned into Clara, as if measuring whether the woman had been broken.
Clara did not feel broken, only lined up differently, as if the breach in the day had made a new muscle in her chest. Being seen by a child for what she had done had something like a baptismal clarity to it. No steam, no formal words, only the honest ledger of what had been risk and what had been choice. The town hum shifted. Word moved along the traffic lights and the barber shop and the gas station. The bikers hung at the edge of it like a guardrail. They gave statements, their faces weathered but steady. Clara made hers in a booth, hat on her lap, the broom leaning against the chrome rail. She had never imagined her name in a police blotter. It felt oddly like stepping into a light that had been turned on in a room you had been afraid to enter. Detective Morrison did what detectives do. She followed threads and stitched them into a warrant. The merit of the claim, the badge, the crop, the parking time, a half-remembered sticker, was enough to move a judge.
Essa realização era o cold piece of wire in everyone's chest. A knowledge that the rescue of a single unit opened onto corridors that could lead further. There were courtroom calendars and press conferences. Legal counsel moved in with clipped voices. The DA filed motions. Names that had been private became phrases in public filings. The community watched, sometimes with a kind of hopeful hunger, sometimes with an impatient need for a finality that justice does not always hand out on a schedule that feels human. The law, Detective Morrison noted, was not a theatrical instrument. It was slow because it was deliberate, and in its slowness there was a kind of integrity. When the press conference finally came, held in the square in front of the courthouse, Clara stood slightly to the side rather than in front. She was not interested in cameras, and she disliked being the center of any light that wanted to make her into a symbol rather than a person. Detective Morrison spoke about the charges, about the importance of reporting, about the work that remained. Sarah M. stood beside a counselor and read a statement that trembled when she saw the faces of those who had helped. The room listened. The microphones were careful, and the words were chosen to avoid sensationalizing what had happened. People clapped in the way people clap for someone who has survived something terrible and lived through it. It was not exuberance, it was recognition. That night, alone in the diner after the plates had been washed and the last pie was gone, Clara traced the line of the bruise on her arm with the pad of her thumb. The pain had become a document, a measure of what she had been willing to put between someone predatory and someone small. She found the bracelet Emma had left with her on the napkin ring, a little butterfly that had been polished by hands that loved it. Clara lifted it to the light. An ordinary charm, she thought, a small piece of something that said, "This person is seen." The months that followed detoured through hearings and counseling sessions and the slow work of repair. More storage units yielded evidence, clothing, letters, makeshift living spaces that did not in any way justify the truths wrapped in them. Sarah M. agreed to work with a local support group in a careful way. She began to tell a piece of her story to a small room of people whose faces were not cameras, but careful listeners. The bikers continued to ride Highway 17. The school revised how volunteers were screened. The diner installed a policy for visitors during school pickup times. Clara's life bent toward the thing that had been opened in her chest. She had once believed she would never leave the town that knew her name at the diner window.
Now, she found herself traveling to neighboring communities at the invitation of small advocacy groups, quietly telling the truth she had come to carry, that ordinary people could be the hinge between danger and safety if they were willing to notice and act. She never spoke of herself as brave. She spoke of listening. She spoke of doing the small things that made a difference, asking a child their name when they drifted past, keeping an eye on a strange car, offering sanctuary rather than assuming someone else would. The language she used was plain and practical and therefore persuasive. Detective Morrison continued to follow leads that suggested the network had tentacles beyond the county. She shared files with counterparts in neighboring jurisdictions, built an interagency task force that did not aim for spectacle but for careful, strategic dismantling of structures that enabled exploitation. The work had fits and starts and dead ends. It taught everyone the humbling truth about the law, that revelations do not always equal closure, that indictments are beginnings of procedure, not finishes. The town, though, had changed in ways both large and tiny. Parents at Riverside Elementary no longer allowed volunteers in without clear IDs. The PTA instituted a guardian program during school pickup hours that paired longtime residents with shift work in the crosswalks. The diner started a small fund to support survivors' immediate needs. Money raised with cups clinked under the counter. People who had once thought their voices small learned how to speak an inconvenient truth with a patience that was not meek. And still, there were evenings when Clara would stand by the kitchen window and watch the headlights of trucks move down Highway 17, where the black ribbon of asphalt dissolved into the country. The road had always been a metaphor in the town's soft language, a line that could either take you away from trouble or into it. For Clara, it had become a promise. She did not want to be famous. She wanted to keep walking towards places where she might help keep a small person from being made small again. One day, a letter arrived at the diner, folded in an envelope that had been written in blocky letters. It was from Sarah M., who had taken her first step towards schooling again. She thanked the people who had helped in a few careful sentences, and enclosed a photograph of a small garden she had started. The photo showed hands in soil, a row of tiny plants already nodding in the sun. Clara kept that photo in the apron pocket at first, then on a bulletin board in the staff room, and finally she pinned it behind the register, where it was a quiet thing that customers did not always notice, but she did. It reminded her of the reason for staying curious and kind. There would be more hearings. There would be challenges. The broader network Detective Morrison suspected would consume long, patient investigations and occasional setbacks.
There was a quiet hope in that choice, an insistence that ordinary people would try to make ordinary places safer, and that the law would be given what it needed: time, evidence, patience. Clara kept the broom as she drove, a strange domestic banner. She planned to stop in neighboring towns, to talk in church basements and at school board meetings, to teach small, practical things. She knew such measures would not end abuse on a calendar, but she also knew that the small daily interventions, questioning, sheltering, reporting, tended to reroute the course of harm. Emma's bracelet looked back at her when she reached for her bag, a tiny metal butterfly that had survived a storm. It did not erase what had happened. It marked that what had happened had been noticed, resisted, and acted upon. Clara kept it as a promise rather than a trophy. The investigation would continue. There would be long nights of redrafting motions and deep dives into obscure ledgers. There would be days when the community's attention frayed, and those who worked in the margins would need encouragement. But the immediate danger had been challenged, victims had been found and cared for, and a town that had nearly missed a child's cry had rediscovered the muscle that recognizes when something is wrong. Clara drove on Highway 17 with the windows cracked, the apron in the back of her car like an old friend, and the smell of coffee still ghosting her clothes. The road was not an escape so much as a commitment. She had been ordinary until the moment she had not been. Now she was someone who would keep moving until she found places where people could be safer. One small action at a time, one listening ear, one report filed, one child sheltered. She did not expect to be remembered in statues or headlines. She expected, more modestly, to stay present in the quiet rooms where survivors healed. That was enough for her. On the horizon, the sun was a strip of promise, and the highway ahead was a line she intended to walk until the work felt less necessary. For now, it was necessary, and she drove into it with the broom at her side and a butterfly pinned like an oath. She drove until the highway narrowed and the space between towns felt less like distance and more like a deliberate pause. The radio was off. She did not want to fill the car with other people's noise. At the next exit, she slowed and watched a row of maples throw long fingers of shade across the pavement. She pulled off, tightened her grip on the broom's handle for a second, and imagined the places she would go. The gymnasium with the varnished floor and the banners high on the wall. The church basement with folding chairs and the smell of boiled coffee. The cramped counselor's office where schedules were kept in a stack of sticky notes. Small rooms, small audiences, small acts that did not look like rescue when done alone, but looked like scaffolding when done steadily, town after town. She did not expect to be remembered in statues or headlines. She expected, more modestly, to stay present in the quiet rooms where survivors healed. That was enough for her. On the horizon, the sun was a strip of promise, and the highway ahead was a line she intended to walk until the work felt less necessary. For now, it was necessary, and she drove into it with the broom at her side and a butterfly pinned like an oath. She drove until the highway narrowed and the space between towns felt less like distance and more like a deliberate pause. The radio was off. She did not want to fill the car with other people's noise. At the next exit, she slowed and watched a row of maples throw long fingers of shade across the pavement. She pulled off, tightened her grip on the broom's handle for a second, and imagined the places she would go. The gymnasium with the varnished floor and the banners high on the wall. The church basement with folding chairs and the smell of boiled coffee. The cramped counselor's office where schedules were kept in a stack of sticky notes. Small rooms, small actions that did not look like rescue when done alone, but looked like scaffolding when done steadily, town after town.
Her first stop was Riverbend, a place perched on a slow bend of a river and built on the confidence that bad things happened elsewhere. The community center sat at the edge of its main street, a brick building that had once been a schoolhouse. Inside, the photo on the wall showed the council in a group shot from the 90s. The carpeting smelled of bleach and memory. Clara set out a small table with handouts she had printed the night before. Short bullet points, scripts for asking children questions without interrogation, a list of local resources, and a compact sheet titled "When You Hear a Child Say Something," a checklist of immediate actions. She tapped the broom against her leg to steady herself and arranged the chairs into a semicircle. People trickled in. 2 teachers from the elementary school, a pastor who still wore his collar like an old comfort, a woman with mud under her nails who introduced herself as the PTA treasurer, a pair of teenagers sent by their guidance counselor,
and one man who kept his arms folded as if the meeting might be cancelled at any moment. Clara began with a simple question. What do you do when a child tells you something you don't expect? A conversation, not a lecture, she reminded herself. She listened to them hedge. We call the police. We make the parents aware. And then steered gently toward the gaps between their answers. She offered phrases that could be used in an instant. I believe you. Can you tell me what happened? You are safe here. She demonstrated how to slow a child's panic with voice and presence, how to avoid leading questions that could give a child words they had not used, how to take notes without turning the moment into an interrogation. The attendees practiced short role plays, each one awkward at first, and then more honest as the scripts worked into their mouths. How do you handle the parents who don't want to know? Asked the pastor, his hands folded as if to keep the question from spilling. Clara told of Emma and of the way the first silence had almost become complicit. She did not use Emma's last name. She relied on the contours of the story. You bring them into the conversation, she said. You remind them that safety is not shame. You give them the language to protect, not the language to punish. She watched faces soften in the dull basement light. A woman near the door wiped at her eyes and then, without journalistic flourish, spoke of a neighbor child she'd seen avoiding a corner of the yard. After the meeting, Clara stayed to speak with her, taking down a description and promising to contact the right person. Not all meetings felt like victories. At a school board meeting later that week, Clara sat on the folding chairs and watched the room divide along the familiar lines. Those who thought her measures necessary, and those who bristled at being told that something so private as parenting might require public procedure. Are we to presume guilt now?
A father asked, his voice a ripple of the wider discomfort. An older woman protested that children were being taught to lie about adults. Clara answered the question she had rehearsed. Conversations about boundaries are not accusations, they are tools. She described a simple change the board could adopt that would take minutes to approve. An explicit requirement that staff report disclosures to a designated officer, and that the school outline the steps so parents would not face a mystery or a cover-up. The measure passed by a narrow margin after heated debate, and Clara felt the fatigue of compromise. A small victory is still a victory, but it never feels like the end. Detective Morrison, meanwhile, lived in different hours. She worked the slow, patient rhythm of someone accustomed to following threads that yielded nothing then, sometimes everything. Her desk was a controlled chaos of evidence bags and printouts, sticky notes perched like a nest of small flags. The ledger Garrett had kept, if ledger was the right word for the bundling of messages and payments and names, was not a neat thing. It was a set of margins and cryptic notations that required a pattern seeing more than an accounting mind. Jonesy, the tech analyst from County, had pulled what they could from bank records and phone logs, but the network Garrett belonged to had been careful. It liked cash and shadowed meetings. "There's a house in Lowry," Jonesy said on a gray Thursday. He pushed a thin photograph across Morrison's desk. The photo was folded, edges creased, a picture of a back porch with a child's bicycle leaning against the railing. They received a series of payments that matched the dates near Garrett's trips. Morrison obeyed a feeling she did not label as hope. It made her fingers quick. We subpoena. We see what falls out of the mailbox. She dialed numbers and wrote notes that looked more like a prayer than paperwork. Lists of names, dates, what was said and unsaid. Somewhere in the sequence, a confident man had thought he could outsource shame. Someone else had kept the books. There were nights of weariness. Morrison, in the solitude of her small kitchen, would rehearse the witness testimony in the same way she might rehearse a child's maneuvers: precise, clear, slow. She thought of Emma's small voice and of the way the child had named what she knew and did not know. If the law had a muscle, it was patience. If it had a prayer, it was for paper, corroboration, witnesses who remembered without coaching. Morrison resented the patience sometimes. She wanted the evidence to present itself like an apology. It did not. Evidence acquitted itself only under persistent light. Back on the road, Clara drove to towns where the word safety still felt foreign, where the very idea of policing the private was an affront.
She learned that there were many shapes of resistance, from denial rooted in protection of reputation to the more dangerous inertia of, "We've always done it this way." She found, too, people who had been waiting for someone to name what their gut had always suspected, that a child's sudden withdrawal or a parent who wanted to be the only teacher in the room might be signs of something else. A school custodian in a town 2 exits down told her almost shyly that he had once seen a man linger in a supply closet and had dismissed it. Now he spoke, and his voice shook less than before. There were also quiet, human exchanges that required no formal structure. A mother who refused to call the police but asked Clara to help her find a counselor. A teacher who wanted a short script to read aloud to the class about consent and keeping bodies safe. A principal who wanted to institute a simple confidentiality policy that would protect reporting staff. Clara wrote them down, made calls, emailed addresses of therapists, and arranged for a counselor from the county to do a day-long training. The work had a domestic cast, file folders, names, times, but it also changed something elemental in the rooms she entered: the permission to notice. On a humid morning in August, Clara stopped by the hospital to check on Emma. She had not been part of the immediate medical response. Hospital staff had done their job, but Clara wanted to sit in the room where a child mended without spectacle. Emma was awake and quieter than before, her hands wrapped in a cartoon bandage that somehow made her fingers look smaller. The mother, a thin woman with an exhausted braid of hair, smiled at Clara with an expression that held relief and the thin, raw scar of mistrust. "You brought the bracelet," Emma said when Clara had sat at the edge of the bed. She reached for the safety pin on Clara's apron with the small, reverent movements of a child handling a sacred thing. Clara let her. For a few minutes, the two of them made no more adults' talk. They spoke in the small circuits of children's conversation, about the color of the bandage, about wistful promises to go back to school with a new backpack, about the harmless errands of being a child. Clara listened to nothing but that tiny life. The mother said, "They want to do forensic interviews. They say it can feel cold, but they say it's best." She looked at Clara, and there was a question in her eyes. Was this right? Clara answered without legalese. "We do what keeps her safe and what keeps her voice clear. You help choose who stays in the room. We make sure she is heard, not led. You control what you can, and we help with the rest." Across the county, Garrett's lawyers filed motions meant to slow and to confuse. They were surgical in their goals: delay, suppress, question the chain of custody. Morrison read each motion with the patience of someone studying a familiar grammar. The defense leaned on loopholes and the neat presumption that the state would be sloppy. There was a hearing scheduled for late September. Detective Morrison and Clara both received terse notices. For Morrison, it was part of the docket. For Clara, it was a summons of a different kind.
She would have to speak in a courtroom, and she knew the way words tightened under oath. "Are you nervous?" Hawk asked one evening when they met at a diner off Route 9. The linoleum hummed under the booths. A waitress with a friendly frown set down coffee. Hawk had a beat-up leather jacket, a Band-Aid on his hand, and the kind of easy humor that meant he did not ask the wrong questions aloud. "Of course," Clara said. She stirred her coffee and watched the tiny whirlpool make a silver ring. "But it's not the same as fear. It's more like a focus." "You'll do all right," Hawk said. "You always make people feel like they can do the right thing." "It helps that I'm not doing it alone," Clara answered. She thought of Morrison's quiet competence, of Cruz and Jonesy's blunt competence, of Jonesy's offhand jokes that made the long nights shorter. She thought of the town's willingness to name its own failures and to choose repair. It steadied her. The hearing arrived with a kind of theater that Clara disliked. The polished shoes, the crisp suits, the camera lenses of local reporters, less for salaciousness than because small towns love to watch their own dravas performed. Garrett sat with his counsel, expression neutral, in a way practiced by people who live by turning off feeling. He did not look like a monster in the daylight. He looked like someone who had learned how to be right in rooms where being right was currency. There was a female witness, a woman abused in youth, who had found the courage to appear. Her testimony was a short, fierce thing that left the room with an audible exhale. The judge, a man whose face carried a patience earned in years of small and large cruelties, listened and asked measured questions. Clara's own turn came later. She took the stand with the broom jacket folded over her arm like a ragged banner. Questions were straightforward. What she had seen, what she had heard, what steps she had taken. Defense counsel tried a tactic that prosecutors expected: to recast good intentions as hysteria, to make watchful care seem like undue interference. Clara answered simply. She said what she had done to keep children safe and why. She did not embellish. Her testimony was not a sermon, but a ledger. Dates, actions, witnesses. Afterwards, a cluster of townspeople who had come to show support gathered on the courthouse steps. A few offered quiet thanks. Others spoke of the changes already felt in their own schools and churches. It was a modest cluster of human gratitude. Handshakes, an awkward hug from a woman Clara had taught to ask better questions. The crowd was not loud.
Its quiet felt steady. But the legal work was not the only front. A week after the hearing, Clara found an envelope tucked beneath the windshield wiper of her car when she returned from a training session in a neighboring county. It was an anonymous thing, no return address, no flourish. Inside lay a single photograph folded in half, the crease brittle with intention. When she opened it, she saw Garrett's name scrawled on the back and a line of handwriting she could not immediately place. It was not a threat in the vulgar sense. It was subtler, a reminder that proximity to harm invites attention. Clara put the photograph into the glove compartment and then, with the caution of someone who knew the law's lines, went to report it. Morrison listened to Clara read the note over the phone and did not feign surprise.
She came by the next day and opened the car door as if entering the space of somebody she trusted. "We'll log it," she said. "We get everything. We will follow up." Her voice carried the gravity of someone for whom threats were another form of evidence. They photographed the envelope, checked for prints, nothing conclusive, and filed a simple report that would sit in Morrison's pile of labeled worries until it did or did not matter. The photograph's existence did not deter Clara. If anything, it amplified the logic she had been living by. Small acts accumulate. She returned to the road with the broom in the trunk and the safety pin on her lapel, and in the spaces she entered, she taught people to listen for bones beneath the surface. She taught the exact words to say when a child whispered something that could not be mended easily. "I believe you. You are not alone. We will keep you safe." She insisted on the mechanics of reporting: a phone number written legibly on a slip of paper, a name, the steps someone could expect. Practical things, she thought, create the scaffolding of safety. Autumn thawed into crispness along the county. Leaves fell in the towns like small confessions. Garrett's hearing made the calendar. Motions continued. Jonesy found a match, a date and a map point that lined up with a payment to an unmarked account. It was not a rope that could hang the case yet, but it was a knot in the right direction. People began to come forward slowly, with small confirmations. A long-avoided conversation with an aunt, a forgotten envelope found in an attic, the memory of a nighttime trip to a neighbor's porch. Clara kept traveling. She developed a quick routine for the end of the day. Remove her shoes when she reached her small rented apartment. Leave the broom against the wall like an old friend. Take the bracelet from the safety pin and tuck it into the pocket of her jacket if she needed to rest. The bracelet had become less an object and more an ethic, an obligation to memory and to movement. One evening, after a long workshop that had drawn more people than she expected, a young teacher lingered behind.
She held a copy to her chest like a talisman and said, "I used your script with a boy who I thought was different. He told me something. I called. They came. He is in counseling now." "There are other things," the teacher said quietly, "that I worry will happen. Parents who will want control, or teachers who will be afraid to lose their jobs. How do you keep going when the system is slow?" Clara looked at her and found an answer that was more honest than rhetoric. "You keep going because people will thank you not for how loud you were, but for how steady. You do the small things until the system can't help but change. That's all any of us can do." Outside, the night had the clear edge of fall. Clara walked back to her car beneath the streetlight and felt the ache of days that asked for more than she had to give. She reached into the glove compartment for the photograph she had reported and found, instead, a slip of paper she had not seen before, a schedule for a meeting at the county office that needed a volunteer to speak. Someone had slipped it there as a nudge. She smiled at the small politics of civility. She could not know then that the rows of evidence Morrison had been assembling were beginning to take a shape that would ask for more than notes and meetings. There would be subpoenas beyond the local, names that would unravel reputations, and a hearing that would be louder and more consequential than the earlier one. But in that moment, Clara felt less like a person moving against a tide than like someone building a dam stone by stone. She drove home with the windows down. The broom rested like a promise, and the bracelet lay warm against her jacket. The town, Mayfield, and the towns she now held in her sleep were not safe yet. But something like attention had been planted along the shoulders of roads and in the margins of church bulletins, and that seed would, in time, root. Detective Morrison sat late that night at her desk and arranged the exhibits. Dates, payments, names, and small corroborations that might, when woven properly, tell the truth in a courtroom that required tidy narratives. She pulled up the last printout and circled a line with a marker. The circle was small but certain, the kind of thing a person makes when they finally see the shape of a puzzle piece that fits. Across the county, Clara dreamed only of small rooms and the sound of children being heard. She woke the next morning and packed the broom into the trunk, the bracelet pinned heavy with purpose. She would go to the hearing when the subpoena said she must. She would continue to teach, to listen, and to build the small domestic systems that could, over time, reroute harm. As the week closed, a judge set a new date for a pretrial conference that would bring more attorneys and a sharper focus to Garrett's network. The county's list of witnesses lengthened like a careful inventory.